Hi, Sohrab.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for
How you
having
do-
me.
Oh, I'm very happy to have you. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You are Sohrab Ahmari, and among other things, you are author of the book Tyranny Inc. How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. A brand new book. I mean, brand new, like being published today, right?
Correct. It's pub date
Yeah.
today.
How you feeling about that?
Pretty good. Just kind of want to get to be honest, it's like
Just get to the
barrage of
bestseller list as
publicity.
soon as possible. Is that what
No,
you
I
were
was
going
going
to
to
say?
say get to bed
Oh, get to
because I've
bed.
just
Okay.
just been doing one after another of these,
Well, you
and
can't have both. If you're going
I
to
know.
rest, then you'll never get to the bestseller list.
Exactly
It
right.
takes tireless work.
Gotta hustle.
So anyway, before we talk about the book per se, I wanted to talk a little about your ideological journey.
Mhm.
Because for one thing, the book is in some ways an ideological manifesto.
Mhm.
And besides, you are pretty well known as the co-founder, I guess, and an editor of this pretty new magazine, Compact, which
Mhm.
is very much an ideological magazine.
Mhm.
You are, I think, typically describes the conservative, although one could get pretty far into your book thinking that you are a raging leftist. And I want
Mhm.
to talk about all that. But first, let's get to the beginning of your ideological journey. You used to be at the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. You wrote for commentary. You were the op-ed editor of the New York Post. All of those things suggest that you may have had neoconservative leanings at one time.
Mhm.
Is that fair?
I would say, especially when I was at the Journal, was when I so do you have to go back a little bit further back. I was, I think this is not that exotic. I was a college leftist or a Trotskyist. And then I made the kind of neoconservatives 20th century journey to neoconservatism, and that is from various forms of leftism, especially Trotskyism, to a kind of it's kind of conservatism whose foundational faith is that American order is all good, and the only thing left to be done now is to make sure that American liberal democratic order prevails all over the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pretty enthusiastic about the Arab Spring and about interventions to accelerate some of those uprisings and so on. But then I think by 2015-16, as the Trump phenomenon was unfolding, I started to voice skepticism, of course, at first muted, in part because I'm institutionally in a kind of neoconservative, hawkish institution. But the outcome of the Arab Spring and of the wider kind of democracy wars of the post 9/11 era, you could see with your own eyes, and you had to admit that they had been disasters. So that's one of the things that prompted a shift in me toward much more of a populist conservatism, a conservatism that's primarily concerned with our fraught domestic relations. And I should, again, and to further the journey, around the same time, 2015-16, I converted to Roman Catholicism. And that conversion put a great deal of stress on the free market side of my kind of formerly kind of Wall Street Journal editorial page ideology. A lot of journal types, and more generally the could call them liberal conservatives or neoliberal conservatives, neocons, etc., who were Catholic. They had tried to blend the Catholic faith with kind of Paul Ryan style economics, and I tried to uphold that for a little while. But the more I sort of read papal teaching on social issues, the more I realized that synthesis of the Catholic neocons like George Weigel and Michael Novak and so on is not a tenable synthesis, and I wanted the real thing, which is much more communitarian and solidaristic. So that's, I gave a long digressive answer, but that's roughly my ideological journey.
Okay, and what was your religious identity before the conversion?
Nothing. I was an atheist. Yeah, I was born in Iran, I should note. But like many Iranians of a kind of my and my parents' milieu, I was totally secular. My grandparents sort of practiced, but even they had like the occasional glass of wine. But I was not raised religiously. You know, when I had to learn to recite large chunks of the Quran in elementary school, it was like quite a crisis because I hadn't really delved into the book at all, and my parents weren't the Quran reading types. So it's a little bit annoying because sometimes especially because I've written about my intellectual and spiritual journey in a memoir, etc. And so it's somewhat public, and so people just get the sort of quick version. They're like, oh, so he was a Muslim, and then he was then he was an atheist, then he was a Catholic, and what is he now? It's not as haphazard and chaotic as that seems. You know, I was basically just a secular urban kid in a upper middle class milieu, and then I immigrated to the United States, and much later that I became Catholic.
Okay. And is it possible to describe what drove the conversion? Was it a single moment, or
no,
something gradual?
I had no immediate sort of Damascene moment.
I've never heard that Damascus turned into an adjective like that.
Yes,
but
it's there.
Okay, no road to Damascus experience as.
No, it was just occasional experiences where I would go to the mass, even when I was secular, in ways that I couldn't explain. But I was drawn to something of that harmony between grace and order that defines especially the Roman Catholic branch of Christianity. Reading Pope Benedict's books, actually reading the Bible, so gradually I came to believe that, okay, I have a conscience. It seems to constantly pester me to do right and to eschew wrong. Where did that conscience come from? There seems to be this moral order in the universe of which I have some clue interiorly. And so this is actually it's the moral proof for the existence of God, which C.S. Lewis mounts in his Mere Christianity, and of course Immanuel Kant in more complex ways. I hadn't read those authors at the time. It's certainly not on that point. But I later learned that particular proof for the existence of a personal God is called the moral proof. So I sort of reached it intuitively. And then, at some point, I was working for the Wall Street Journal in London, beginning in 2013, if I recall. And yes, 2013. And, I stepped into a church called the Brompton Oratory, which is very famous for its traditional liturgy, the sort of bells and smells. And
is it in Latin, the liturgy?
Yes, but it's the new mass in Latin. It's not the traditional. The one that drew me was not is just.
I'm not sure I would have noticed the difference if it was in Latin myself, but
yeah,
whatever.
No. Well, I didn't know at the time either. I thought I had heard there's something called the Latin Mass, and I didn't realize that there's the Tridentine liturgy, the pre-1962. The 1962 is the last version of it, and then there's the current mass that most Catholics attend, which is sometimes called the Mass of Paul VI or the Novus Ordo. And this was that mass just in Latin.
Okay.
But anyway, it really brought home this kind of reflections on conscience, order, tradition, etc., such that I was so, I felt impelled to just go to the Oratory House, which is just a place where the priests live, and knock on the door and asked the first priest who opened the door that I wanted to become Catholic, and he just said, "Very well, I shall instruct you."
Well, that was nice.
Yeah.
We'd all like to have a personal spiritual tutor. So it sounds like there were kind of two things going on ideologically. There was a disenchantment with traditional conservative foreign policy that was just kind of empirically based. And then there was a disenchantment with traditional conservative domestic policy that grew to some extent out of this religious conversion, and I guess out of a particular reading of the meaning of Catholicism and Christianity.
Very well put. Yeah, good summary.
Okay, and let me ask you before we get to the book itself. I mean, if one didn't know anything about you and they're reading this book and we're told that you were still called a conservative, I think the question would arise about halfway through the book, well, what part of you is conservative? I see what isn't conservative, and is it too is it too crude a caricature to say, well, you're anti-woke? That's conservative?
I think that is too crude. In this, with the politics has grown as anti-woke, I increasingly find frustrating and downright grifty at times. And there are elements of woke ideology and practices that I find sort of silly, and that ranging from silly, obnoxious to like downright sinister. But I don't make my I'm not there. There is a class of people who are like, I just like the way neoliberal order was proceeding circa 2013, and can't we just go back to that, and get rid of this woke stuff? That there's, my friend Barry Weiss, just to reach for an example, is someone who I would describe that way. But I have, I have a deeper critique of where we are that have to do with political economy, and I actually find that sometimes the anti-woke stuff becomes a way to not talk about, class issues, economic issues, deeper crises, and just make it about something that is very red meat, not justly red meat, I would say, in some ways, because there's great deal of inanity in the woke movement. So no, I would say that. So to answer your question, the way I'm conservative is that it has to do with my sense of a telos, of an endpoint of a good society. That I want a society in which there's human flourishing, and I draw on the classical and Christian tradition to define what human flourishing looks like. We're rational animals. We like to contemplate. We're social animals. We're political animals, and that means we want to exercise our political faculties. We flourish in family. We flourish when we have time to spend, with the higher things, with God, with our loved ones, etc., and not when we're atomized, harried, and miserable. And so, insofar as I have that kind of a, again, I would describe it as a classical and Christian account of the common good, and that the role of politics, a function of politics, is ultimately to secure the common good of the whole, as kind of Aristotelian a concept as it goes. That is the part of me that's conservative. But conservatism for me, therefore, does not mean, preserving whatever, particular economic arrangements that have, just been handed down to us, since the Reagan era, and saying, well, that is it. We just got to preserve these tax rates, this free trade regime, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, in order to bring about that vision that I hold dear for what society should look like, I find that often it's the left that has the better material critique of how we got there, of the causes. And in some cases, especially when you look at the New Deal tradition, has fairly decent solutions, kind of humdrum reforms that were nevertheless quite radical when FDR and his cohort proposed them, that actually helped stabilize American capitalism, and in some ways, therefore, to stabilize American culture during those kind of roughly 3 decades after World War II. And so I draw lessons from that, and I'm very happy to, in other words, I'm very happy to be called, for example, as Jonah Goldberg called me, a pro-life New Dealer. I'm happy to accept that label. I think actually a lot of the actual New Dealers were pro-life because this was the 1930s. But beyond that, I mean, the ideal that represents, it resonates with me, and I think it's historically, based on American economic history, it's the best response to the crises of the unhindered American market society. And I also do think, that the ideal of the New Deal it resonates with certain Catholic ideas. So the problem, just put it bluntly, which is the topic of Tyranny, Inc., to put it most blunt, is problem of private coercion, which is something that comes about as a result of vast disparities in income and power generated by the market. So it's about class antagonism. But the New Deal tradition, and in many ways Catholic social teaching, aims not at the abolition of one class by another, or the total abolition of private property, which is what harder left socialists would want, but rather a sort of class compromise. And this takes all sorts of names, like social democracy or the New Deal order in the United States. I use the term political exchange capitalism, as in we have a market exchange, but we try to compass it within a broader political exchange between the classes, a recognition of the rights of the assetless many as well, etc. So, no, I would not just say, well, what makes me conservative is that I'm anti-woke, even as I might find some woke things irritating.
Okay. So yeah, let's talk about the book. At the beginning of it, I was kind of thinking it might be about surveillance capitalism. In other words, the way companies use digital technology to invade our privacy and so on. But it really is. It's a critique of capitalism very broadly, and that's why, as I said, you can get pretty far into it, wondering what's conservative about you. So a lot of maybe we can skip over the surveillance capitalism stuff because that has been so well covered. Unless you want to talk about that. The big theme, as you said, is just the fact that whenever there is an imbalance of power between two people, you can't necessarily count on market solutions to be just, I guess. So for example, the whole question of contracts, which I hadn't given a lot of thought to. I've never been victimized by an obscure clause in a contract I signed, maybe because I haven't had many conventional employers. But in your view, this is a pretty pernicious feature of capitalism, right? There tend to be constraints upon workers built into contracts that they either are unaware of or don't have enough power to raise questions about.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a big problem in the United States. To just give a couple of examples from the book, I show the actually quote from an actual large company employment agreement, which includes, among other things, the right of the employer to not only confiscate your own personal devices if they're company owned, but even your personal devices that you own yourself. If they at any time they want to examine what you have on your personal device, if you use your personal device to access, the company network, which, by the way, they encourage you to use your personal device to access the company network as a, you also in the same agreement sign away your singing voice, your voice in general, your persona, your look, everything about you as an employee that's being recorded by, like, if you're a salesperson or making sales calls and so forth, that's being recorded. And the contract says the company, your employer, it's not just for them to put it in the brochure or a training recruitment video or something like that, but that they make lease or license your persona, your voice, etc., to commercial third parties for commercial purposes. You have an age now coming up of like virtual reality porn, and you could foresee, that your image is being leased, and the contract says that you don't have the right to sue either your employer or any third party to whom they've leased or licensed your persona, voice, etc., to in perpetuity. So the reason that comes about in that way is because typically individual employees, given the nature of most markets where you have far fewer employers than you do employees, there's a vast disparity in bargaining power. And yet this kind of liberty of contract mindset, which governs especially how the right thinks about employment, pretends like the employer and employee meeting each other their power is symmetrical and their bargaining power is sort of optimal as it is, and therefore not requiring external intervention. That's, because a lot of Econ 101 is premised on a late 18th century sort of Arcadia of, yeoman farmers and individual artisans and mechanics. This brief period in the development of capitalism when it actually sort of resembled the picture laid down by the founders of laissez-faire like Adam Smith But then by the mid 19th century, you have an industrial economy. Most markets are dominated by a few sort of giant actors, and so this optimal relationship based on mutual kind of symmetrical power is a fiction. It's not how most people experience your typical employment agreement. For example, when you take a job, you've typically moved across town or across the country. You've leased a new vehicle or a house or what have you. Your partner, your spouse has moved along with you, and then you show up on the first day on the job and you're given this fat contract that includes this clause that you sign away your right to your persona, your voice, even your singing voice. Well, most people just sign that, and no one, or vanishingly few people say, "Hey, I don't like this clause. Could we revise it?" And it just that is just not even an option, because the way that the power that employer now has over you because of your lease, because of your childcare obligations, your elder care obligations, most people go along. So the contract formation is much more asymmetrical than this kind of conservative account of labor market suggests. And we can also go into, how this is used to increasingly bar workers from mounting legal challenges when they have legitimate grievances, including
before we get into that, let me just drill down a little on. I was going to say, like, on the one hand, there probably aren't all that many cases, I mean, proportionally speaking, of kind of ordinary workers who find their company suddenly using their singing voice or their likeness or anything like that. On the other hand, as we enter the age of artificial intelligence, I can well imagine employers using recordings of people giving tech support or any kind of customer support to train an AI for their replacement, right? I mean, that seems to me a very plausible thing. And it wouldn't be very evident to the people whose work is being used, because they're just one tree in a whole forest of trees that are kind of being chopped up, so to speak. But I would think that's going to be a big issue. And you're saying people have basically, a lot of workers, without knowing it, have already signed away their right to protest.
Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely right. I mean, it's not just this one type of clause. You sign away your right to sue if you're injured in company outings. When there's like a team outing, et cetera. You're supposed to play a baseball game, which, by the way, they say is totally voluntary, but try doing that, try not showing up and seeing what that does to the team player portion of your annual review. You're called to sign that away. Or like I said, the surveillance of your devices. And I think this kind of the kind of example that you raise is all too real. The possibility that your voice and your persona is then leased to AI companies for further development, or to Apple's Siri service, and all of it ultimately is aimed at your own long-term dispossession as a worker, and the loss of your job. I mean, this is all pretty sinister.
So, you do spend a little time on this issue of arbitration, and how, again, I would think very few workers are aware of this, but they've kind of signed on to how any disputes between them and the company will be handled, and often they're not handled in a way that's likely to be favorable to the employee, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, arbitration is a very ancient practice. It goes back to medieval times, when instead of going through litigation, which is expensive and heartbreaking and takes a long time, two disputing parties, like two feudal landlords, would agree to submit their dispute to, say, the church or to some neutral mediator, so you can get quicker and more generous in a way, in terms of procedurally quicker, more generous, and ultimately with greater comedy, a kind of resolution to your dispute. But that practice, was incorporated into American law in 1925 under something called the Federal Arbitration Act. And the Federal Arbitration Act, which was championed by people like then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, merely aimed explicitly aimed and merely aimed in the congressional history to allow merchants of relatively equal bargaining power. That's the important part. Relatively equal bargaining power to agree to submit their disputes to private arbitration, which is a kind of private court. It's not a courtroom. The judge doesn't even have to be a lawyer or have a law degree, and in this way to save litigation expense on both ends. It was never intended to apply to the employment context. In fact, Herbert Hoover, when he was testifying on behalf of the law and promoting it, he wrote a letter to Congress to try to assuage members of Congress that this wouldn't be used against weaker parties in a kind of take it or leave it format. Yet, as a result of a kind of legal revolution mounted mainly by conservative justices who call themselves originalists, gradually since the 1980s, the ambit of the Federal Arbitration Act has been expanded to the employment context, where, for example, and this is a real case which I recount in Tyranny, Inc., of an Ernst & Young employee at the accounting giant Ernst & Young, whose name was Stephen Morris, who, by the way, the arbitration clause wasn't part of his initial package of agreements, but this firm sent a notice to employees saying, henceforth, if you show up to work next day as a condition of continued employment, you agree to submit your disputes through mediation and arbitration. As it happens, Morris argued or alleged that he was entitled to unpaid wages under the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is a New Deal law that guarantees you overtime pay and it guarantees you overtime pay. And so he used what is a New Deal statute aimed at promoting collective bargaining and collective action more generally to vindicate his rights. But the firm said, no, remember, there was that arbitration thing you agreed to. And I say, quote unquote, agreed to, because obviously he just had to show up to work the next day for the clause to take effect. And it would have cost him, Ernst & Young acknowledged, it would have cost Morris $200,000 to litigate this. And I say litigate again because it's not a real court, but to push this through individual arbitration. So the only way that it would have been rational for Morris to vindicate his rights under a federal law where he was entitled to overtime pay, about $2,000, would be to spend orders of magnitude more. So, of course, that's not rational, and most people don't do it. The only way he would have been able to actually vindicate his Fair Labor Standards Act rights would have been if he is allowed to either bring a class action or at least a class arbitration. But the clause barred that, the arbitration clause. And of course, our Supreme Court, 5-4 majority, conservative majority led by Justice Gorsuch, said no, that the parties freely agreed to arbitrate their disputes. And therefore, the liberty of contract doctrine holds that they have to be bound by those terms. Of course, the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg utterly eviscerated the logic of that, and she pointed precisely to the legislative history, which showed that Congress never intended for this kind of arbitration situation where it's one party that's much weaker and is told take it or leave it, and suddenly renounces, his or her statutory rights, especially a statute which comes out of an intention of empowering workers to do collective action, has now been defanged in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So all of this, I mean, the fact that workers sign these elaborate contracts that they can't be expected to really go over with a fine-tooth comb, and the fact that those contracts include typically, as kind of a last resort, an arbitration mechanism that's probably not going to work out too great for the worker. All this explains why you get the kind of conditions that have been described in, for example, these Amazon warehouses, where people, there are strict limits on bathroom breaks and so on and so forth. Now, as you say, the ultimate source of this is a disparity of bargaining power. I mean, Amazon can say to any one person who's applying for a job, no, we don't want you, because there are a lot of roughly equally qualified people. And the worker doesn't have the same leverage. And of course, one solution to that is collective bargaining, unions. And, the demise of unions in the United States was often kind of justified by reference to international competition. So, for example, in the auto business,
Mhm.
They said, well, look, if we don't change the amount of power that unions are exercising over wages and so on, we're just going to lose out to the Japanese, and pretty soon there won't be any jobs in the American auto industry. And that's an argument that has some merit. But the funny thing is, like an Amazon warehouse, that logic does not apply. You can't, I mean, I guess, some jobs, are in American warehouses and in principle could be outsourced, but not an Amazon warehouse, because it's a way station to delivery in America. And it's so I mean, I don't know why is it. I understand why there was all this anti-union pressure. I understand it's a logical matter in areas subject to international competition, but it seems like that was accompanied uh, by kind of pressure against unionization in a realm where it makes a lot less sense, right?
Yes, you could. I mean, there's data to think through this. Um, Automation and globalization certainly contributed to the decline of private economy, unionism in the manufacturing context, right? That's where globalization and automation did damage. But there are studies from, the Economic Policy Institute, which is a left of center think tank, does great work on this stuff, that where, economists will plug in today's sort of deindustrialized conditions back into the otherwise kind of the shape of the labor market in the 1970s, and they find that the decline in manufacturing barely affects the ultimate decline. Not barely, but only marginally affects the decline in unionism. In other words, the fact that manufacturing was globalized was only one factor and not a decisive one in the decline of unionism. So then the question becomes: yes, okay, in manufacturing that was an issue, but why is it that unionization rates are so low in, like you said, in Amazon warehouses or in the service industry, retail, etc.? And so you have to come up with a better answer. And of course, the typical conservative answer is, well, American workers have realized that just unions aren't very good, and they don't like unions. Well, again, it's belied by the facts. Depending on which study you look at, there are tens of millions of American workers who would want to, if they're given the option, who say they want to join a union but are currently not represented by one.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, unions are more popular than they have been in half a century. So, okay, you eliminate that. The only one that really remains, and I think it's the most persuasive one, is that over the period of nearly 9 decades since the Wagner Act, the 1935 National Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, where Congress said, not only do we no longer are we going to suppress labor unionism, but we're going to encourage it. Collective bargaining in most industries was something to be encouraged. In the passage of time since 1935, conservative Supreme Courts, conservative, GOP-dominated National Labor Relations Board, et cetera, have gradually chipped away at the ideal of the Wagner Act, which was supposed to have we wanted to create a mostly unionized economy. And it worked, in 1945, about a third of the private economy workers in the country were unionized. So now it's down to 6%. That's because it's just gotten much, much harder to successfully make it through the gauntlet that is the American labor law. So you have to first get enough signatures on a petition, about a third of the workplace to get an election. Then you have to win the election. Then you have to win a contract within a year after you win the election. Those are the that's the 3-step dance required to unionize a workplace. And along the way, all these kind of different methods of barriers have been put up that make it harder and harder. Unions were barred from being able to speak at captive audience meetings where only the employer could speak. Employers were allowed to, just short of threatening that they would fire employees, they could sort of scare workers into saying, hey, if you join a union, we may have to close the shop. So it's just skirting the idea of whether or not you're threatening or not. And every time employers violate these rules, of course, all they get is a slap on the wrist, or maybe they get another election. But by then, the message will have had its union chilling effect. So gradually, what was supposed to have been a legal regime aimed at increasing collective bargaining in the workplace has paradoxically yielded an economy in which it's actually very, very hard to do that. So yes, I mean, okay, we've got to think about manufacturing, and there's serious talk about reshoring manufacturing, how to deal with automation, like how to keep moving our workers further up the value chain so that they're dealing with still doing valuable work and in the teeth of automation, et cetera. All that is fine, but the degree to which we downplay just the role of frankly legal class warfare against the American labor union is pretty stark.
Okay. Now, you spend a chapter on a particular worker at Sears, whose job kind of became more and more frustrating and less worthwhile as Sears underwent its demise. And that hit me in a couple of ways. First of all, I'm very sentimental about Sears. We moved around a lot when I was a kid, but there was always a Sears. And plus, every year, the Sears Christmas catalog would come. In fact, when I heard about the bankruptcy a few years ago, I finally went to the closest Sears to us before it closed and bought a lot of stuff to remember it by, things related to my youth or my family, But the other way that hit me is that I just served on a jury, and during the jury selection process, I was shocked at what a low yield they got, and how many people said, "I just can't do this. I can't afford to do this job." And it struck me that there was a time when I think more people were kind of lifers at a given company. It's like, I remember the guy across the street from us when I was a kid. He was a Safeway guy. He was going to be a Safeway guy his whole life. And companies like that, I think, would actually, if you had jury duty, they would probably pay your wages while you had jury duty. But these days, fewer and fewer people have that. So the demise of the Sears-like employment situation is, I think, is an important phenomenon. Now, you put some of the blame on a fairly recent innovation in capitalism, which is the private equity firm, because in its death throes, Sears was in the hands of a private equity guy,
a hedge fund, but
he was a hedge fund guy.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
You kind of combine the two in your indictment: hedge funds and private equity.
Correct.
But I was wondering, and I don't really know that much about the way private equity and hedge funds work. I mean, I know private equity, they like to buy companies, I don't know, somehow make them more efficient in some ruthless way and then sell them or something. And they manipulate debt in ways that may or may not work out for everyone's good. But my question was going to be, wasn't Sears kind of doomed anyway? I mean, the business model was deeply challenged by the coming of the online world, right? It's like the department stores generally aren't doing well. So,
well, yes and no. The trouble for Sears actually began before the rise of the internet. It began in the 1970s when actually the firm was at its peak. That's when they just had, they got the Sears Tower, which for a long time held the record for the largest, tallest building in the world in Chicago, et cetera. But around that time, they started to neglect their core retail business, and they started doing what was called the socks and stock strategy, where not only did Sears sell, socks, like sturdy American socks, but also, things like, insurance through, it's a subsidiary, Caldwell Banker for real estate, even the kind of proto-internet service, believe it or not, called Prodigy, the Discover card, et cetera. These were all Sears brands. And so then, this other model of shop came along that was salesman free. We're talking about Walmart, Kmart, and Circuit City, et cetera. They were salesman free and, quite attractive on price and other stuff like that. And so they lost sight of that, and it took a long time, and they still were printing the catalog as late as the early 1990s. So they had to suddenly adjust, and it took a while for them to adjust. But plenty of other stores, retail establishments continue to, do well. Like luxury department stores are still quite strong, and a lot of people still, want to see the product before they buy it. Not everyone wants to buy stuff online. So, I do think that, just at the moment when it needs just at the moment when Sears may have needed kind of rethinking its business, revamping, etc., where it could have survived. There's plenty of other retailers that you can think of that have made it through that crucible of the early internet era. Sears had the misfortune of falling into the hands of a guy named Eddie Lampert, who was a hedge funder. And what Eddie Lampert did to Sears parallels what a lot of kind of Wall Street firms, hedge funds and private equity are doing to the real economy. The real economy is where, we are supposed to make things that are, ordinarily seen as being useful or services that are useful and productive, and not just the moving around of money on between different sort of complex entities using these Byzantine financial instruments, which is what a lot of these Wall Street firms do. So the way that Eddie Lampert eroded the capital base of Sears instead of actually investing in it is pretty reflective of a wider trend in the American economy. And just to briefly explain what he did, he would not invest in anything. He briefly invested in a kind of website revamp, but then, that didn't really take off. But otherwise, he was managing for cash flow, as they say, which is just to try to extract as much cash as possible. He would have Sears sell his own hedge fund, or these entities that he set up called Seritage Fund. He would have Sears sell real estate that it already owned to his firm, and then he would rent it back to Sears and pocket money that way. So in short, he was asset stripping the firm. And whenever there were, gradually the stores just started to fall apart. Like no one wanted to go to a Sears when there's, the potholes in the parking lot, when there's fixtures that aren't repaired, et cetera. This didn't have to happen. It's because he was just extracting maximum shareholder value for short term rather than investing in the firm. And that's what we see in the wider economy, actually. Most people think, what does a corporation do? It borrows money and then uses that money to make something that people like, and then sells that. And then along the way, it pays back its creditors or the bank or whoever it might be, while still retaining enough funds to reinvest in the business, which is what you need, because your capital wears down, and your buildings wear down. There's sort of wear and tear. You want to reinvest in the building to the buildings and the people, et cetera, to keep it going. And that's what American companies used to do. The majority of American companies used to be sustainers of their capital base, but beginning since the kind of revolution in private equity and hedge fund, and just the general takeover of the real economy by the financial economy, the majority of American firms are actually eroding their capital base. They return most of their earnings back to shareholders, which means they don't reinvest in the business. And in this sense, it's like a plant that you don't water. Eventually, it'll wither. And that's what most American corporations do. If you look at publicly traded corporations, to look at their investment behavior, the majority are currently eroders of their capital base. And so what happened to Sears is, the predicament of many companies. And this is because private equity and hedge funds don't have that mentality of sustaining a business where a guy can work 30 years and the community flourishes as a result. They just want to extract that, maximum shareholder value, which is why ownership by private equity dramatically increases the likelihood of a firm going bankrupt. And that's fine from the point of view of the private equity owners, because what they think about is they invest in 10 firms. If 9 of them go bankrupt, but one of them they do really well with, it's all a wash and they come out okay. But the ordinary worker or community can't be like, the ordinary worker can't be like, well, I'm taking 11 jobs and hoping that one of them works out on average. Likewise, communities don't think that way. They have the business here. This is the major business in town. Oh, this is the one bet we've made. This is what we care about. And so they can't think in the same risk profile that comes naturally to Wall Street.
Hmm. Um, there's another thing you talk about, kind of the demise of local news and kind of crisis in journalism. Um, it's another thing that some people would attribute to the inexorable march of technology and wonder whether anything could have been done about it at all, and maybe also argue that although old-fashioned local newspapers have kind of fallen away, there actually are alternative sources of information online and so on. Um, but you see this as kind of part of the larger crisis.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are, just to start with, people think, oh, no one wants to read news anymore. There are individual newspapers that are doing fine based on the subscription model. Wall Street Journal, where I used to work very early on, got into the paywall game and invested in digital and does quite well with that. New York Times as well, but also actually there are regional papers that have survived this transition as well. The Boston Globe, the Minneapolis Star Tribune, they're all doing fine, and but many other local papers are not doing well, and of course part of this is because of big tech's the blows to their ability to win advertising dollars, and this is you know big tech monopolistic practice. What big tech does is it forces news organizations to be on both sides of an ad transaction. What that means is, on the one hand, or rather, it forces them to compete both on ad and content. On the one hand, Facebook is an advertiser, so you're in the market for selling this or that thing. You go to Facebook, and Facebook serves as your advertiser. But at the same time, and in that sense, it competes with traditional media companies. At the same time, Facebook is also a content provider. And if you want to get your content out there as the news organization, you are at the mercy of Facebook as well. And so in this sense is what people mean by being on both sides of these transactions is Facebook. And so that did a whole lot of damage. Thousands of newspapers, including storied papers, either went bankrupt, or in the case of like the Christian Science Monitor, it went to online only in a much reduced shell of its former self. But that wasn't all. And then private equity and hedge funds came into the picture. And private equity and hedge funds, actually, in the case of newspapers, they don't run them entirely to the ground. They turn them into ghost papers because they're managing for cash flow. And if you take over a paper and you immediately fire 70% of the journalists and you sell much of the real estate, and you kind of it's a local paper, but all it runs is copy from syndicated copy or national copy, which they can duplicate across numerous local papers, well, that's a lot cheaper, and you're just extracting a lot of cash. But the result is that in a lot of communities, either there isn't a local news outlet, or the outlet that's there is what's called a ghost newspaper. It publishes national content that has all sorts of terrible ramification. I mean, in the chapter on this, I just marshaled a study after study in the fact that when there isn't a local newspaper, bond ratings go up for the municipality because local officials don't feel as accountable, and so they're not good stewards of public funds. When there isn't a local newspaper, people are much more likely not to split ticket vote. In other words, it's a veritable American tradition where you say, I'm going to vote for the Republican for governor, but I'm actually going to go for Democrats in the House. And this it's a barrier against extreme polarization. But studies have found that when there isn't a local paper around, people are much more likely to just go straight down the line. I'm going to vote on all my culture war issues. So I'm going to pick, Democrat for president, Democrat for House, Democrat for, local judge, et cetera, or Republican. And, this way it elevates people that really shouldn't be in office just because of whatever their party is. So voter sophistication goes down, voter engagement goes down, a sense of alienation goes up. People who don't read local news also tend to be pretty kind of just out of tune with their community. They don't know what's going on in their community. They don't like their community. They're just angrier, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's just all the ramifications explode. Again, the sort of immediate profits that Wall Street expects when it takes over newspapers don't serve the wider kind of function that the founding fathers thought was so essential about newspapers. These such easy mediums for circulating knowledge and good morals, as George Washington put it, as about newspapers. And the founding fathers cared about it so much, about this issue, that not only did they, obviously carve out a First Amendment specifically of freedom of the press, but they went further. They actually, through the Postal Service, they subsidized periodicals. The mailing of periodicals for a long time was subsidized by the U.S. government, even if it meant charging more for stamps on other sorts of mail. They would do that in order to help circulate ideas and circulate information. So again, I think a lot of things that we're used to thinking of as natural developments, the newspaper was bound to die, the department store was bound to die, are actually the result of political choices, coercive political choices made by an elite few and at the expense of the many.
Okay. Well, listen, we've been talking almost an hour, and as regular listeners and viewers know, typically after that part of the podcast, which is public, we go into what's called overtime, and that's available to paid subscribers of the Nonzero newsletter, and it's easy to become one. You Google Nonzero and Substack, or else click the link in your the show notes of the podcast app. And I encourage people to do that. Also want to thank the people who've been with us so far. But yeah, let's go into overtime now, because I want to talk about a few things, quickly touch on foreign policy, maybe a little bit about Donald Trump, and broadly the question of what we're going to do about all this, what your prescription is.